So I'm currently work at Victoria University, where I'm a professor. I'm based in the Institute of Health and Sport as a research fellow, and I also work with Mundani Balak, Indigenous Academic Unit at our university in a research capacity development role. It's been a long career. I started out with an area of interest in migrant research, partly because of my own family and personal history of growing up in South Africa and then migrating during a very turbulent time in our country. And my research interest really stems from the experiences that we had of being migrant and being displaced and having to re-narrate and reorganize and understand our lives in a new country. So I think I started studying. I at one point was a teacher and then started studying. My studies took me to an area that was developed and called community psychology. But the Ph.D. work that I pursued was probably an intersection of cultural psychology, of liberation psychology, and of migration and migrant studies. So that's where I started out. And then my encounters and travels from Victoria, where I studied, to Western Australia, which is another part of Australia, took me into Indigenous studies and community arts. And so I've worked my way through and developed different approaches to understand the challenges that minoritized or racialized and colonized groups of people encounter and their struggles around liberation, and that includes our own journey. It's studies that engages with Indigenous topics, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous as in First Nations people, and then Indigenous as in people who are native or local to a particular area. So in the Australian context, our research and working relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. So some of the topics, I guess, that have emerged in that is the history of colonization and the legacy of colonization and its effects on that's currently still seen and experienced by Indigenous people and also other communities of people who are racialized. So we're interested in topics such that we can understand sometimes as violence, how race and racism is a form of violence, and also how people then respond to that, how they resist that, and how they transform systems that impacts upon them negatively. So the research is to some extent interested in the dynamics of community power relationships in terms of dominant group, minority groups, and so on. So those themes around race, around power, and around intergroup relationships are probably holds the work. Yeah. So the work that I do has got maybe two or multiple foci. There's lots of things that have to happen. The first is we have to understand how we think and conceptualize racism, or how we think or conceptualize violence that's based on race, yeah, or making someone different and inferior. So we're interested in that, and we're interested in understanding how our discipline, which is psychology or any other research endeavor, is part of the process of creating and supporting differences that are made negative because we, through our institutions, have been complicit with doing colonizing work. And so that's an area in the literature. And then I think part of what we're interested in is to understand in people's everyday lives the effects of racism, what it looks like, what it feels like, but then also the ways in which people resist it, and then also how do we then work together to change systems so that we can address racism and its consequences. So I think my experiences of working with or working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups in Australia has been varied. In Western Australia, I worked with an organization called the Community Arts Organization, who created partnerships with Indigenous communities. So I learned a lot together with them about the challenges and the fairly implicit ways, the fairly soft ways in which we continue to produce exclusion. So I learned from Aboriginal people that typically when researchers come, they would say that research have been part of the problem, and that what we should be doing is we should be fixing the systems that produces the problem. So one of the key lessons that I learned from Indigenous people was that we have to examine the systems that we're part of and how those systems impact upon Indigenous people. So the lesson there was look at where power sits and how we can actually influence power. The second key thing that I learned from Indigenous people is that Indigenous people have got knowledge systems that centers reciprocity and relationships, and that thinks about the world in very different ways, organizes the world in very different ways to the Western systems that we've been used to. And so once you start and engage with that, you also then have to think about how do you do research that is sensitive to and responsive to and respects different perspectives. It has to match with the community, because if you bring in your own agenda, then it's no longer the agendas of the community or the worldviews or perspectives of the communities. I think Australia is talked about as a multicultural country in lots of ways, because we have people who have migrated and settled on Indigenous land, and Indigenous people have been there for millennia, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and they are diverse themselves. So there's not just one homogeneous Indigenous group. And then we also have white settlers who've come, created this idea that there's a white nation, but it's also migrants who have come from lots of different places, including Europe. And then you've got different waves of migration from Indonesia, from South Africa, from different African countries. So all communities have got histories, all communities have got cultures, ways in which they've gone about making their lives and constructing their lives and so forth. But not all communities' lives have been equally valued, or all their cultures have been equally valued. So the sorts of challenges that we have is how do we understand diversity without devaluing diversity and difference, and how do we understand the importance of culture, of retaining culture in terms of people wanting to hold on to traditions, people wanting to practice traditions and so forth, that's similar or different, but you'll often find the reasons why people do things or hold on to things are ways of expressing humanity, of looking after people, of caring for people, and of sharing with people. So there's lots of things that human communities do that's very similar and very shared. In terms of Australian communities and Indigenous, to be honest with you, I don't know how to understand how the term Indigenous is used in the Indonesian context, because the communities are so diverse, the different religious groups, the different islands. So there's a lot of diversity here. But the things that always resonate or stand out for me is the reciprocity, the care and the hospitality that communities show. And that's the experiences that I also have with Aboriginal communities in Australia. There's a group where I've learned about this by quite serendipitously, because I worked with a community organization in Western Australia who they talked about a practice that they call community arts and cultural development. And so it's looking at how do we build and foster community, intentionally coming together to build community. But the process that they use is that they work with arts modalities. So whether that's writing, performance, painting, all sorts of things, to look at how do we mobilize art for people to express themselves, for people to build community, and for people to articulate their imagination of what their futures want to be. So I learned about art in the context of community making processes. And so I was interested in this because these people were using art in the context of building or strengthening relations between within Indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities, and also between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So arts became a vehicle for community building. The more I learned about this and the more we think about this work, the more I started to make connections between arts and culture. And for me, culture is really, really central. Culture and meaning systems. Yeah? Culture as the way in which people organize their life worlds, the resources that they have, the values that they have. But arts is almost to some extent the physical expression of culture, yeah? and psychology, and so I'm interested in those sorts of things. But you can see that in Indigenous communities, arts isn't just about a commodity or something to be sold and so forth. Art is the actual expression of these are our worlds, our life worlds, and this is how we express it. So you see differences in terms of the value and the practice of cultural work or cultural practice. I think here in Indonesia, when I visited Yogyakarta, one of my colleagues, also an Indonesian scholar who's in Yogyakarta, took me to see Joko Pikek's work. And so there's art for protest, art to raise awareness about politics, and so on. So you can see art is used not only for health, for well-being, but it's also used to create awareness about how people experience the world, and it can be for individuals, but it also be for the public. But we don't associate psychology with it sometimes, because we said, they're doing arts, but they're actually creating community and finding ways to express. So I think there's a strong connection to be made between or with the things that people do to express their life worlds and the psychology of that process. Look, I think a lot of there's individual art. So one of the people whose work I talked about in the presentation was one of the colleagues. She explicitly talks about how arts and arts practice for her served as a vehicle to deal with experiences and feelings of exclusion. So at an individual level, because it becomes a means to make sense of, to communicate, to externalize inner worlds in a way. But we're also interested in arts at the collective level. So they're interested in saying that if this has been so beneficial to me, how do we collectivize this and how do we share this modality with broader groups of people so that they can also use this as a means to understand themselves, but also as a means to articulate their experiences, collective experiences, and then to also figure out how do we mobilize this for change work and how do we use it to build community. So that person, that's one example of how through individual engagement with art, you actually find ways to give meaning to the world and then also to use that very experience to collectivize it so that it moves beyond an individual to groups and to group processes. Okay, so in my context, and I think I've learned in Indonesia, the power relationships, maybe they work differently, hierarchies, who has power, who doesn't, and so forth, works a little bit differently. But in my context and in university context, sometimes there's a group who will say that they've got epistemic power. They decide on what counts and what doesn't. So in our work, we say that, well, people's lived experiences, young people, minority people, migrant communities, they have got voices, and the knowledge and experiences that they have should be included and brought alongside. So their knowledge is valid, and if it is to be contested, it can't be dismissed. It needs to be discussed and included alongside expert knowledge. So epistemic inclusion is a process of how do we make sure that marginalized communities have got a say in what counts and what's important and so forth, as opposed to only the powerful, sometimes bureaucrats, sometimes academics, sometimes politicians, sometimes scientists have a say, but it's also saying that how do we include and create spaces where community dialogue and community voices can be included in knowledge-making processes. For me, it's always been about the space that we create, and the way in which people and the groups of people we work with, the way in which they embrace the space, and the way in which they come to develop their own capacities to be active agents. So the group of people that I've worked with, who I mentioned also, I've worked with them maybe, oh my God, it's been a very long time, maybe 8 years or something, from when they were young people just starting to when they now manage to get themselves to a position where they are a collective themselves. So for me, this work has been quite profound, but it told you that change processes doesn't just happen in a short project. There might be good benefits and so forth, but for this group of people, they moved from relying on an organization to establishing a collective where they are in charge of the work that they want to do. But the thing that was most rewarding for me was when we had a seminar and they talked about the work that they did, and they talked about the role that we had in the process, and that the knowledge that we produced sits alongside their knowledge, and that we are part of the collective that they created. And I think that was an example of where they decided the terms of epistemic inclusion, as opposed to where we were in a position to make decisions about that. And that was like for me, this is like the moment when people agency has come to be realized through the journey that we've been on together over many years. Yeah. For me, I always think about research as a creative process. I think of working with and alongside communities as opening up the possibilities to be creative and be in support of others. And I think of art and arts as just, because it can go in all sorts of directions. Art speaks to people in multiple and in very different ways. Yes, so affectively, spiritually, it's not just a written word. So globally, you can see a lot of people are interested in community engaged work and so forth. So arts, culture, community, those three things together are really important. And I think if you want to, and I think the possibilities are there for us to think together and to create psychologies that mobilizes art, or that supports people to reconstruct culture, and also supports people to imagine and to work together to restore things that have been taken away. And so community engaged research, the way that I think about it and the way that I've been doing this, is organized at that interface where culture meets arts meets people. So I would say for all researchers, think about research and think about your passion. I think that's the main thing. For me, research is about that opportunity to create and to be creative with research, as opposed to reproduce theories and so on. It's more about how do we, and I think that what I've learned from the indigenous communities too, how can you be accountable to community first, and how do you use research and community making processes to support the aspirations and goals of communities, of people in communities. It's not just the thing that you do. I think it becomes a way of engaging with the world, and a way of understanding the world, and the way of contributing to changing the world, I think.
Lead and innovate.